I never thought a simple video could change how I saw my own family forever. One quiet evening, scrolling without interest, I saw my son smiling beside his wife and her family, laughing easily, speaking freely. And then I heard the words that stopped my breath. I was not a father to be respected or a man who had sacrificed quietly for years. I was a freeloader, an ungrateful burden they joked about while enjoying a life I had paid for without question. In that moment, something inside me cracked, not loudly but completely. I remembered every bill I covered, every problem I solved in silence, every time I stepped back so they could step forward. I remembered the promises never thanked and the loyalty never returned. That video was not meant for me, but it revealed everything I was never supposed to see. The betrayal was casual, effortless, and that hurt more than anger ever could. I did not confront them. I didn't argue. I watched, listened, and made a decision that would change all of our lives. What they did not realize was that comfort has a source and silence has a limit. From that night on, I began preparing in ways they could not imagine. I let them believe nothing had changed while every thread holding their easy life together slowly loosened. If you think this is just another story about family disappointment, stay with me. Because what comes next is not loud or cruel, but precise. And by the end, you will understand why some lessons only arrive when the money stops and the truth finally has nowhere left to hide. My name is Charles Whitmore. I am 64 years old, a retired civil engineer who spent 37 years designing bridges and overpasses across the American West. I've been a widower for 2 years now, since the morning Eleanor closed her eyes and left me alone in a house that still smells like her lavender soap. The morning it all began felt like any other. I woke at 6 as I always do and made my coffee in the old percolator Eleanor refused to replace. She said the new machines made coffee taste like plastic, and even now I can't bring myself to buy one. I stood at the kitchen window watching the sun climb over the Rockies, steam rising from my cup, and thought about nothing in particular. That's the strange gift of grief. After enough time, the silence stops hurting and just becomes the shape of your days. I had my routine, and routines are what keep men like me from falling apart. Morning coffee. A walk through the garden Eleanor planted where I still talk to her roses like she might hear me. Breakfast alone at the table we bought together 40 years ago, and on the first of every month a transfer of $2,000 to my son Daniel's account. I never asked for thanks. I never expected acknowledgement. Giving is simply what fathers do, and I had always believed that love was its own receipt. That afternoon, I made the mistake of opening my phone. I rarely use social media. Eleanor was the one who kept up with such things. But Daniel's wife Lauren had tagged him in something, and curiosity got the better of me. I tapped the notification and waited for the video to load. It was a gathering at Lauren's parents' house. I recognized the living room from photographs, cream-colored walls, expensive furniture, people holding wine glasses like accessories. The camera panned across smiling faces. I half knew Lauren's sisters, her father with his politician's grin, a few friends whose names I'd never bothered to learn. Music played in the background, something modern and forgettable. Then I heard my name. Lauren's voice cut through the noise like a blade through paper. She wasn't speaking to the camera, she was talking to someone off-screen, unaware that the phone was still recording. "Dad Whitmore," she said, and I could hear the sneer before I saw her face. "Please." The man's basically a freeloader living off Daniel's future inheritance. The room erupted in laughter. Not polite laughter, not uncomfortable laughter, the genuine kind, the kind that comes when people feel safe enough to be cruel. I watched Lauren's mother raise her glass in mock salute. I watched Lauren's father shake his head with amusement. And I watched my son, my only child, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle and drove to college and walked down the aisle at his wedding. Daniel said nothing. He smiled. He lifted his glass. He drank. I played the video again, then a third time. Not because I couldn't believe what I'd heard. I've lived long enough to know that people rarely surprise you. They only reveal themselves. But because I wanted to memorize every face, every laugh, every silent agreement that Charles Whitmore was a joke, a burden, a man to be tolerated until he had the decency to die. Freeloader. The word echoed in the hollow of my chest. Freeloader. As if the house they lived in hadn't been possible because of me. As if Tommy's school tuition paid itself. As if the checks I'd written for 15 years had come from thin air rather than decades of my labor. I closed the app, set down the phone, sat in Eleanor's chair by the window, and watched the afternoon light fade over the mountains. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text Lauren. I didn't do anything at all, because for the first time in my life I understood that some wounds cannot be healed with conversation. Some betrayals are too complete for explanation. The house was quiet. Eleanor's roses swayed in the evening breeze, and somewhere deep inside me, something that had been asleep for 40 years began to wake. I heard every word clearly, and for the first time in 40 years of being a father, I didn't look for excuses to forgive my son. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in the darkness of our bedroom, Eleanor's side of the bed still untouched after 2 years, and found myself counting. Not sheep, not breaths, but dollars. The mathematics of fatherhood tallied in the silence, like an accountant settling a debt no one had asked to see. It started with Daniel's student loans, $47,000 accumulated over 4 years at the state university interest, compounding while he searched for his footing after graduation. He called me one evening, voice tight with shame, and said he didn't know how he'd ever pay it off. I told him not to worry. I wrote the check the next morning and never mentioned it again. That was 1998. Daniel was 23. Lauren hadn't yet entered the picture, and my son still called me every Sunday just to talk. Then came the house. Daniel and Lauren had been married 2 years when they found the place in the suburbs, a modest colonial with a big backyard perfect for the children they were planning. The down payment was $85,000, and Daniel's salary at the marketing firm couldn't stretch that far. "We'll pay you back," he promised, standing in my living room with blueprints spread across the coffee table. "Every cent, Dad, I swear." I nodded and smiled and transferred the money that week. The repayment never came. I never asked. Tommy arrived 3 years later, a beautiful boy with Eleanor's eyes and Daniel's stubborn chin. When he turned 5, Lauren decided public school wasn't good enough for her son. She found a private academy with a prestigious reputation and a tuition of $12,000 per year. Daniel called apologetic, as always, explaining that they were stretched thin. I told him education was the most important investment a family could make. I paid for 8 years without complaint, watching my grandson grow through photographs and occasional visits that never lasted long enough. The credit card debt came in waves. Twice, Daniel confessed that things had gotten out of control, once when Lauren remodeled the kitchen without a budget, once when they took a vacation to Europe that somehow tripled in cost. $34,000 in total, erased with 2 phone calls to my bank. I never lectured. I never criticized. I simply solved the problem because that's what fathers do. And through it all, the monthly transfers continued. $2,000 every first of the month for 8 years running. Just a little help, I told myself. Just until they get on their feet. But the feet never seemed to find solid ground, and the help became expectation, and the expectation became entitlement. So gradual, I didn't recognize it until I heard my daughter-in-law call me a freeloader on a video meant for people who would never know the truth. $347,000. I did the math that sleepless night, adding columns in my head like I was back at the engineering firm, reviewing project budgets. $347,000 given freely, without contracts, without interest, without a single demand for gratitude. Eleanor would have known the exact figure. She always kept better records than I did. But Eleanor was gone, and I was left alone with numbers that no one else would ever acknowledge. She had tried to warn me. I remember the conversation clearly now, though I dismissed it at the time as the worry of a dying woman. It was 3 months before the end, when the cancer had stolen her appetite, but not her clarity. We were sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, and she took my hand with a grip that surprised me with its strength. "Don't let them know the numbers, Charles," she said. "The moment they see a figure, they'll see an obligation, not a gift. They'll calculate what they're owed rather than what they've been given." I told her she was being pessimistic. I told her family didn't need accountants. I told her that love was enough, that gratitude would come naturally, that Daniel was our son, and Lauren was his wife, and blood was thicker than spreadsheets. Eleanor just looked at me with those knowing eyes and said nothing more. Now, lying in the dark, I remembered something else. In her final year, Eleanor began meeting privately with Margaret Hale, her closest friend from college. Margaret had been an estate attorney before she retired, sharp as a tack and twice as pointed. The meetings happened every few weeks, always at Margaret's house, always without me. When I asked Eleanor what they discussed, she smiled that mysterious smile of hers and said, "Girl talk, darling, nothing you'd find interesting." I believed her then. I'm not sure I believe her now. What were you planning? Eleanor, what did you see that I was too blind to notice? The questions circled my mind like vultures over carrion, and still sleep would not come. I stared at the ceiling until dawn crept through the curtains, painting the room in pale gray light, and realized that my wife had understood something about our son's family that I had refused to see. Eleanor tried to warn me. I just never imagined she could be so completely right. The morning after my sleepless night, I decided to finally do what I had been avoiding for 2 years. I would organize Eleanor's belongings. The closet full of her clothes, the boxes of photographs, the drawers stuffed with decades of accumulated memories. I told myself it was time. Perhaps what I really wanted was to feel close to her again, to search for answers in the artifacts of our shared life. But as I sorted through her things, my mind kept drifting backward to the day Lauren first walked through our front door. Daniel had been dating her for 6 months, and he was eager for us to meet the woman he planned to marry. I remember Eleanor squeezing my hand as we waited in the living room, her expression unreadable. When the door opened and Lauren stepped inside, I thought I understood why my son had fallen so hard. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. Lauren had a way of making you feel like the most important person in the room. She complimented Eleanor's cooking with such sincerity that my wife actually blushed. She asked me about my engineering work with genuine curiosity, or what seemed like genuine curiosity at the time. She offered to help with the dishes, to clear the table, to handle anything that needed handling. "Please let me take care of that," she said over and over, her smile wide and warm. "You've done so much already. Just relax and enjoy." We were charmed. At least I was charmed. Eleanor remained quieter than usual that evening, watching Lauren with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I asked her later what she thought, she paused for a long moment before saying, "She's very polished, Charles, very polished indeed." I took it as a compliment. I should have heard it as a warning. The wedding was lovely. The early years seemed happy enough. But somewhere along the way, Lauren's helpfulness transformed into something else entirely. It happened so gradually that I didn't notice until the patterns had already calcified into permanence. She began managing the family calendar, deciding when we could visit and for how long. Christmas at her parents' house became mandatory. Thanksgiving rotated, but somehow our turn never seemed to arrive. When Tommy was born, I assumed we would see more of our grandson, but the opposite proved true. Lauren controlled access like a border guard, citing nap schedules and doctor's appointments and activities that couldn't possibly be interrupted. "Maybe next weekend," she would say, and next weekend would become next month, and next month would dissolve into the blur of another year. The condescension crept in so slowly I mistook it for concern. "Dad, you don't need to worry about that," she would say when I asked about Daniel's work or their finances. "Let me handle it. You just enjoy your retirement." At first, it felt like kindness. Then came the sharper edges. "You're not as sharp as you used to be, Dad. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Aging happens to everyone." She delivered each comment with that same smile, the one that curved her lips but never quite reached her eyes. I started to dread her visits, though I couldn't have articulated why. Eleanor, I noticed, had stopped trying to hug her hello. I found the journal in the bottom drawer of Eleanor's nightstand beneath a stack of old birthday cards and a faded photograph of our wedding day. It was a simple leather-bound notebook, the kind she used for grocery lists and appointment reminders. But when I opened it, I realized this was something different. These pages contained her private thoughts, written in her careful handwriting, dated and organized like evidence in a case she was building against an unnamed defendant. I flipped through the entries, my heart beating faster with each page. Most were ordinary reflections, worries about her health, memories of our early years together, notes about books she wanted to read. But then I reached an entry dated 3 years before her death, and the words stopped me cold. "Lauren doesn't love Daniel," Eleanor had written. "She loves what he'll inherit. I've watched her calculate every interaction, measure every kindness against what she might gain. Charles won't believe me if I tell him. He sees the best in everyone, even when there's nothing good to see. That's why I love him. That's also why I need to do something myself. I've been talking to Margaret about options, legal protections, ways to ensure that Charles is safe when I'm gone. I don't know yet what form it will take, but I refuse to leave him defenseless against that woman." I read the passage 3 times, each word landing like a stone in still water. Eleanor had seen through Lauren years before I caught even a glimpse of the truth. She had recognized the predator circling our family while I was still admiring the predator's smile. And she had been planning something involving Margaret, something legal, something designed to protect me from a threat I didn't even know existed. I closed the journal and pressed it against my chest, as if I could absorb Eleanor's wisdom through the leather binding. The late afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom window, casting long shadows across the floor. Somewhere in this house, or perhaps in Margaret's possession, there were answers waiting to be discovered. Eleanor had not left me defenseless after all. She had simply been too wise to tell me about the armor until I was ready to wear it. My wife wrote this 3 years before she died. She knew, and according to this journal, she was planning something. The question is, would I set Eleanor's journal aside that evening? But her words followed me through the house like ghosts. She had seen the truth about Lauren years ago, had tried to protect me from beyond the grave, and all the while I had remained willfully blind. But as I sat in the darkening living room, watching shadows stretch across the floor, my thoughts drifted from my daughter-in-law to my son. Lauren was the architect of cruelty, yes, but Daniel had been her silent partner, and that silence had its own weight, its own particular betrayal. The memories came unbidden, rising like bile. I thought of my 70th birthday 4 years ago now, when Daniel and Lauren had promised to host a dinner in my honor. I arrived at their house with a bottle of wine and a heart full of foolish hope. The table was set beautifully, candles, flickering cloth napkins folded into elegant shapes. But there were only 4 places: Daniel, Lauren, Tommy, and an empty chair that I soon realized was meant for Lauren's mother, who arrived 20 minutes later with apologies for her tardiness. I stood in the doorway, bottle in hand, and understood that there was no seat for me at my own birthday dinner. Lauren's face arranged itself into an expression of theatrical dismay. "Oh no," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "I completely forgot. I'm so sorry, Dad. Let me get another chair." She made it sound like an innocent mistake, but I saw the flicker of something else in her eyes, satisfaction perhaps, or simply the pleasure of a small, deniable cruelty. Daniel said nothing. He helped bring another chair from the garage, a folding metal thing that wobbled on the dining room carpet, and placed it at the corner of the table where I would have to crane my neck to see anyone's face. He didn't meet my eyes. He didn't apologize. He simply sat down and began passing dishes as if nothing unusual had occurred. There were other moments, dozens of them accumulated over years like sediment forming stone. Holiday visits cut short because Lauren suddenly wasn't feeling well, though she always seemed to recover the moment I left. Invitations extended and then withdrawn because something came up. Always something vague, always something that couldn't be questioned without seeming petty. The time I drove 3 hours to watch Tommy's soccer game only to find the bleachers empty and the field dark. When I called Daniel confused, he said Lauren had told me the wrong date. An honest mistake, he assured me. These things happen, but the moment that crystallized everything was smaller than the rest, almost trivial in its cruelty. I had stopped by their house unannounced one Saturday afternoon, hoping to take Tommy for ice cream. Through the screen door, I heard my grandson's voice, bright with the innocence of a 6-year-old. "Why can't Grandpa come to my game tomorrow?" he asked. "He said he'd teach me how to catch better." Lauren's response came quick and smooth. "Grandpa's too old for that, sweetheart. He'd just slow you down. We'll find someone else to help." I stood frozen on the porch, hand raised to knock, and felt something crack inside my chest. Too old, too slow, a burden to be managed rather than a grandfather to be loved. I lowered my hand and walked back to my car without making a sound. I never mentioned it to Daniel. I never mentioned it to anyone, but I watched my son through the window before I drove away, and I saw him sitting at the kitchen table close enough to have heard every word. He said nothing. He did nothing. He simply continued reading his newspaper as if his wife hadn't just taught his son to dismiss his grandfather as irrelevant. For years I told myself Daniel was weak, a man so desperate to avoid conflict with his wife that he would sacrifice his own father on the altar of domestic peace. I pitied him even as I resented him. But lately something has started to bother me. The way he looks at me sometimes when Lauren isn't watching. It's not the vacant stare of a defeated man. It's something else entirely. His eyes hold a quality I can't quite name. Anticipation, maybe? Or guilt? Or something stranger still, like a man waiting for permission to speak. I've tried to decode that expression, to understand what lies behind my son's careful silence, but the answer eludes me. Perhaps he is simply a coward, as I've always assumed. Perhaps there is nothing beneath the surface but the hollow echo of a man who chose comfort over conscience. Or perhaps I'm wrong. Perhaps Daniel is playing a longer game than I've given him credit for. It doesn't matter, not anymore. Sitting in the darkness of my living room, Eleanor's journal resting on the table beside me, I made a decision. I would not explain myself to people who should already understand my worth. I would not beg for respect from those who should offer it freely. I would not attack because vengeance is exhausting and I am too old for theatrics. I would simply stop. Stop giving, stop hoping, stop pretending that my love could purchase what should have been given without cost. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking seconds I would never get back. Outside, the Colorado night was vast and cold and utterly indifferent to the small tragedies of family. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle around me like a blanket. My son stayed quiet through all of it. But silence comes in different forms. I just haven't figured out which kind his is. The decision to act came quietly, without fanfare or ceremony. I woke the morning after my resolution with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of denial had lifted, and in its place was something sharper, more focused. I would not make grand pronouncements or deliver ultimatums. I would simply begin to withdraw one small thread at a time and see how long it took for anyone to notice the fabric unraveling. I started with the auto insurance. 2 years ago, Lauren had called me with a request wrapped in the language of family obligation. Her car insurance premiums had increased, she explained, and money was tight. Daniel's salary only stretched so far. Would I mind terribly covering the payments for a few months just until they got back on their feet? Family helps family, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the one that expected compliance. I agreed without hesitation. The few months became a year, then 2, and the $200 left my account every month like clockwork. That morning I called the insurance company and canceled the policy. The representative asked if I was sure, reminded me that the coverage would lapse immediately, warned me about the consequences of driving uninsured. I thanked her for her concern and confirmed my decision. When I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. It took me a moment to identify the sensation. It was relief. The particular relief of setting down a burden you didn't realize you'd been carrying. I didn't call Daniel to explain. I didn't text Lauren with a warning. I simply let the payment lapse and waited to see what would happen next. 3 days passed in silence. I tended Eleanor's garden, cooked simple meals for one read books I'd been meaning to finish for years. The quiet was almost peaceful. Then my phone buzzed with a text message, and the peace evaporated like morning dew. Dad, something's wrong with the insurance. Can you check on it? Thanks. Lauren's words glowed on my screen, casual and demanding in equal measure. There was no greeting, no inquiry about my health or well-being, just an assumption that I would jump to solve her problem as I had always done before. I read the message twice, then set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and returned to my coffee. An hour later, the phone buzzed again. Hello, this is kind of urgent. The double question marks conveyed irritation poorly disguised as concern. I imagined Lauren staring at her phone, waiting for the response that always came, growing increasingly agitated by its absence. The thought gave me no pleasure, but it gave me no guilt either. I had spent 15 years responding to every summons, solving every crisis, absorbing every slight with a smile. The silence I offered now was not cruelty. It was simply the sound of a man who had finally stopped volunteering for his own diminishment. The third message arrived that evening, and its tone had shifted from demanding to accusatory. Daniel said, "You're being weird. What's going on?" I stared at those words for a long time. Daniel said, "You're being weird," not "Daniel is worried about you" or "Daniel wants to talk." Just a report of my strangeness delivered without context or compassion. I wondered if my son had actually said those words, or if Lauren was simply using his name as a weapon. Either possibility depressed me equally. I turned off my phone and placed it in the drawer of the hallway table where it could buzz and chirp and demand attention without disturbing my peace. Then I walked to the bedroom and retrieved Eleanor's journal from its hiding place beneath my pillow. The leather felt warm in my hands, as if it still held some trace of her body heat. I had read through most of the entries by now, tracing the evolution of her thoughts from mild concern to deep suspicion to something approaching certainty. But tonight I turned to a page I hadn't examined closely before, dated just 2 months before the cancer stole her voice for good. The entry was shorter than the others, written in handwriting that trembled slightly at the edges. I could see the effort. Each word had cost her the determination to communicate something vital before time ran out. "If Charles is reading this," she had written, "it means I'm gone, and it means he's finally ready to hear what I couldn't tell him while I was alive. I tried so many times to warn him about Lauren, about the way she looks at our savings like a wolf eyes a wounded deer. But he wouldn't listen. He couldn't listen. His faith in family is the most beautiful and most dangerous thing about him." I paused, swallowing hard against the lump forming in my throat. Even in her final days, Eleanor had understood me better than I understood myself. The entry continued. "I've made arrangements with Margaret. Legal protection safeguards things Charles would never have agreed to if I'd asked permission. Margaret knows everything. When the time comes, she'll explain. I only hope Charles can forgive me for going behind his back. Everything I've done out of love. He'll understand that eventually. He always does." I closed the journal, slowly pressing my palm flat against the cover, as if I could reach through the pages and touch her one last time. Eleanor had been planning something significant enough to involve attorneys and legal documents, something she'd hidden from me because she knew I would resist. And Margaret Hale, her oldest friend, held all the answers. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Outside, the Colorado wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of approaching autumn. I thought about calling Margaret immediately, demanding explanations, but something held me back. Eleanor had written that I would be ready when the time came. Perhaps the time had not yet fully arrived. Perhaps I needed to understand the depth of the betrayal before I could appreciate the scope of her protection. Eleanor wrote, "Margaret knows everything." But everything about what I drove to Margaret Hale's house on a Tuesday morning, when the autumn sun hung low over the Rockies and the aspens along the highway blazed gold against the evergreen pines. She lived in a modest craftsman bungalow outside Denver, the kind of house that suggested comfort without pretension. Eleanor had always said Margaret was the most practical person she knew, a woman who spent 30 years as an estate attorney and retired with the wisdom to know exactly what mattered and what didn't. I hadn't called ahead. Part of me worried that if I gave her warning, she might prepare evasions, rehearse deflections. But as I pulled into her gravel driveway and saw her standing on the front porch with 2 cups of coffee, I realized my caution had been unnecessary. Margaret had been waiting for me. Perhaps she had been waiting for years. "Charles?" she said as I climbed the porch steps. Her voice was warm but unsurprised, as if my arrival was simply the next item on a schedule she had memorized long ago. "Eleanor said you'd come eventually. I just didn't know when." She handed me one of the cups and gestured toward a pair of wooden rocking chairs that faced the mountain view. I sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted by the weight of questions I didn't know how to ask. Margaret settled into the chair beside me, her silver hair catching the morning light, her eyes sharp with the intelligence that had made her one of the most respected attorneys in the state. "You found the journal," she said. It wasn't a question. "I found the journal," I confirmed. "She wrote about you. About meetings, legal protections, things she couldn't tell me while she was alive." Margaret nodded slowly, wrapping both hands around her coffee cup. "Eleanor loved you more than anything in this world, Charles. But she also knew you. She knew you'd never agree to certain precautions while she was alive to argue with. You'd say she was being paranoid, that family should trust family, that Lauren deserved the benefit of the doubt." She paused, a sad smile crossing her face. "She used to call it your beautiful blindness, the way you insisted on seeing good in everyone even when the evidence pointed elsewhere." I wanted to defend myself, but the words died in my throat. Eleanor had been right. I would have fought her every step of the way. "Tell me about my finances," I said instead. "Tell me what Lauren actually controls." Margaret set down her coffee and leaned forward, her expression shifting into something more professional. "That's the first thing we need to address. Lauren believes she has significant influence over your financial situation. She's mentioned it to several people, including a financial advisor she consulted last year about what she called family estate planning. She thinks she's positioned herself at the center of your wealth." "And is she?" Margaret's smile sharpened. "Not even close." She rose and disappeared into the house, returning a moment later with a thick manila folder. She handed it to me, and I opened it to find a comprehensive overview of my financial life bank statements, investment summaries, property deeds, retirement account balances. I recognized Eleanor's handwriting on some of the notes, and my chest tightened at the sight. "Let's start with the basics," Margaret said, settling back into her chair. "Your house in Colorado, the one you and Eleanor bought 32 years ago, is in your name only. Eleanor made sure of that when she reviewed your estate documents 5 years ago. Your investment portfolio, approximately $400,000 in index funds and bonds, is held in accounts that list only you as the owner. Your retirement accounts, your pension from the engineering firm, your Social Security benefits, all yours, all untouchable by anyone who isn't you." I flipped through the pages, watching the numbers blur together. "But what about the joint account Daniel set that up years ago, said it would make things easier for family expenses?" Margaret nodded. "The joint account exists, and yes, Lauren has access to it through Daniel, but do you know how much is in that account right now?" I shook my head. $12,000, Margaret said. "That's the account Lauren monitors like a hawk, the one she uses to track your spending habits and judge your financial decisions. She thinks she's watching your whole kingdom, Charles. In reality, she's watching the gift shop." The metaphor landed with unexpected force. I thought about all the times Lauren had made comments about my spending, the pointed observations about restaurant meals and new books and charitable donations. She had been auditing $12,000 while remaining completely ignorant of the hundreds of thousands that lay beyond her reach. "Lauren thinks she's the banker," Margaret continued. "In reality, she's just the teller. She can see small transactions make small withdrawals feel important about small decisions. But the vault is locked and she doesn't even know it exists." I closed the folder and pressed my palm against its surface, feeling the weight of information I should have understood years ago. "Eleanor did this. She restructured everything without telling me." "She protected you," Margaret corrected gently. "There's a difference." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The mountain breeze carried the scent of pine and wood smoke, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily against the endless blue sky. I watched it rise on the thermal currents, effortless and free, and felt something loosen in my chest. "There's more," I said finally. "The journal mentioned something you're holding, something Eleanor gave you." Margaret's expression flickered a brief shadow crossing her composed features. She looked away toward the mountains, and I saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Eleanor gave me something to hold," she admitted, "something important, but she made me promise not to reveal it unless certain conditions were met." "What conditions?" She turned back to face me, and her eyes held a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "I can't tell you that, Charles. Not yet. Eleanor was very specific about the circumstances that would trigger the next step. She knew her plan might take years to unfold, and she was prepared to wait." I leaned forward, frustration rising in my throat. "Margaret, I've spent 2 years grieving my wife while my daughter-in-law called me a freeloader and my son stood by in silence. I think I've earned the right to know what Eleanor was planning." Margaret reached over and placed her hand on my arm, her touch gentle but firm. "You have. And you will. But not today." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "Soon, I think. Sooner than either of us expected. Events are moving faster than Eleanor anticipated. Margaret is hiding something Eleanor left behind, and whatever it is, it's been waiting for exactly this moment." The weeks that followed my visit to Margaret's house became a quiet education in the art of strategic patience. I learned that victory doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it moves in silence, document by document, signature by signature, while your opponent remains blissfully unaware that the ground beneath their feet has already shifted. Margaret had opened my eyes to the truth of my financial position, but she had also shown me something equally valuable, the depth of Lauren's delusion. My daughter-in-law believed herself to be the architect of our family's financial future, when in reality she was merely a spectator watching a play from the cheap seats, convinced she was directing the action on stage. I discovered the extent of her fantasy through Daniel, of all people. He called one evening ostensibly to check on me and let slip that Lauren had been telling her friends she was managing Dad Whitmore's affairs since he's getting a bit forgetful. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of cold anger through my chest. Forgetful. The woman who had never held a job longer than 2 years was telling people she managed the finances of a man who had spent 4 decades calculating load-bearing tolerances and budget projections for million-dollar infrastructure projects. But I said nothing to Daniel. I simply filed the information away and continued my work with Margaret. We met twice a week at her bungalow outside Denver, always in the morning, always with fresh coffee and folders full of documents that required my attention. Margaret approached the task with the methodical precision of the attorney she had been for 30 years. Every move we made was legal, documented, and invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. First, we updated my beneficiary designations. The life insurance policy that had listed Daniel as primary beneficiary for 20 years was quietly amended. The retirement accounts that would have passed directly to my son were restructured with new contingencies. I didn't remove Daniel entirely. He was still my son, despite everything. But I added layers of protection that would ensure Lauren could never touch a cent without meeting conditions she would find impossible to satisfy. Next, we changed passwords. Every online banking portal, every investment platform, every account that could be accessed electronically received new credentials that existed only in my memory and in a sealed envelope Margaret kept in her office safe. Lauren had somehow obtained my login information for the joint account years ago, probably through Daniel, and had been monitoring my transactions with the vigilance of a suspicious spouse. Let her watch, I thought. Let her see the small deposits and modest withdrawals and believe she understands the full picture. Finally, we consolidated accounts. The scattered investments Eleanor and I had accumulated over decades were gathered into a single well-protected portfolio managed by a firm Margaret trusted completely. The statements went to a post office box I had rented in a neighboring town, far from any mailbox Lauren might access during her visits. Through it all, I maintained the appearance of the confused old man Lauren believed me to be. I answered her occasional texts with vague pleasantries. I accepted Daniel's dutiful phone calls with the patience of a father who had long ago stopped expecting substance from his son. I gave them no reason to suspect that the ground beneath their assumptions was eroding with every passing day. Then Margaret presented me with the final piece of her strategy. "I need you to get Lauren to sign this," she said one morning, sliding a single page across her kitchen table. The document bore the heading Investment Account Authorization and was filled with the kind of dense legal language that made most people's eyes glaze over within seconds. I picked it up and scanned the contents, but the terminology was beyond my engineering expertise. "What is it?" Margaret's smile held an edge I hadn't seen before. "On its face, it appears to be a routine authorization allowing family members to receive information about your investment accounts, the kind of thing financial advisors send out every few years for compliance purposes." She paused, her eyes meeting mine with steady intention. "What it actually does is remove any existing access permissions for non-account holders. Once Lauren signs this, she loses the ability to make inquiries or request statements or claim any connection to your investments whatsoever." I stared at the document, understanding slowly dawning. "She won't read it." "No," Margaret agreed. "She won't. Lauren has spent years cultivating the image of someone who handles financial matters with competence and authority. She won't admit even to herself that she doesn't understand what she's signing. Her pride won't allow it." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I would present the document to Lauren during my next visit, frame it as routine paperwork my financial advisor needed for his records, and watch her sign away her last claim to involvement in my affairs. She would do it with confidence, perhaps even with condescension, never realizing that her eagerness to appear capable was the very trap that would spring shut around her. It happened exactly as Margaret predicted. I drove to Daniel's house on a Saturday afternoon, the document folded casually in my jacket pocket. Lauren greeted me with her usual mixture of false warmth and barely concealed impatience. When I mentioned that my advisor needed a family signature for some routine paperwork, she practically snatched the page from my hands. "Of course," she said, already reaching for a pen. "I handle all of Daniel's financial documents too. It's easier when one person keeps track of everything." She signed without reading a single line. I watched her hand move across the page, confident and unhesitating, and felt nothing. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not even the grim pleasure of revenge. Only the quiet recognition that justice sometimes arrives not with thunder, but with the soft scratch of pen on paper. I thanked her politely, tucked the document back into my pocket, and endured another hour of stilted conversation before making my excuses to leave. As I drove home through the fading autumn light, I called Margaret and reported my success. "She just locked herself out of the vault," Margaret observed, "and she has no idea." Lauren thought she was winning. She didn't realize she'd just signed away her last key to my kingdom. The first snow of the season fell on the day Lauren's carefully constructed world began to crack. I stood at my kitchen window watching the flakes drift down like tiny messengers of change and felt the particular stillness that comes before a storm breaks. I didn't know yet what was happening 40 miles away in my son's house, but I sensed it somehow, the way old bones sense a shift in weather. I learned the details later, pieced together from fragments and overheard conversations, and the voicemail that would change everything. But even without the specifics, I could imagine the scene with perfect clarity. Lauren at her laptop, credit card in hand, booking the vacation she'd been planning for months. The Maldives, she had told her friends. Private bungalows over crystal water spa treatments, 5-star dining. A trip that would cement her reputation as a woman who had arrived, who commanded resources, who lived the life others could only envy. The total came to $15,000. Lauren entered the card number with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything she truly wanted. She clicked the confirmation button and waited for the receipt that would validate her position in the world. Instead, the screen displayed 2 words that must have stopped her heart. Transaction declined. She tried again, certain there had been a technical error, the same result. She pulled out a different card. One linked to an account she believed she monitored and controlled the account. She thought represented her access to the Whitmore family resources. Declined again. Lauren called the bank. I can imagine her voice in those first moments, the practiced calm of a woman accustomed to having problems solved for her. "There must be a mistake," she would have said. "I need to speak with a manager. This is a joint family account." The representative's response was polite but firm. "Ma'am, I'm showing that you're not authorized on this account. You're not listed as an account holder or an authorized user." "That's impossible. Check again." "I've checked twice, ma'am. The records are clear. Perhaps you could contact the primary account holder to clarify the situation." The call ended. And then, according to what I later pieced together, chaos erupted in my son's house with a fury that shook the walls. Lauren screamed at Daniel with an intensity that brought Tommy running from his room in tears. She accused my son of conspiring against her, of hiding money, of being complicit in some elaborate scheme to humiliate her. Daniel, by all accounts, stood in the kitchen and absorbed the assault with the practiced stillness of a man who had weathered many such storms. He didn't defend himself. He didn't fight back. He simply waited for the hurricane to exhaust itself. When it finally did, when Lauren had retreated to the bedroom with mascara streaking her cheeks and threats of lawyers echoing in her wake, Daniel picked up his phone and called me. I was sitting in my living room when the screen lit up with his name. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I watched it vibrate against the coffee table, watched his name flash with each ring, and made a decision I had never made before in 41 years of being his father. I let it go to voicemail. The silence after the ringing stopped felt like a held breath. I sat motionless in Eleanor's chair, staring at the dark screen, waiting. Part of me expected the phone to ring again immediately, expected Daniel to persist until I answered, expected the familiar dance of crisis and rescue to begin anew. But the phone stayed silent. Then the voicemail notification appeared. I let it sit for nearly an hour before I gathered the courage to listen. I made myself a cup of tea, checked on the temperature in Eleanor's greenhouse, reorganized a shelf of books that didn't need reorganizing. I was stalling and I knew it. Finally, with the winter darkness pressing against the windows and the house settling into its nighttime sounds, I pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room, and it was nothing like what I had expected. "Dad." A pause, a breath that sounded ragged. "I know what you're doing. I understand." Another pause, longer this time. "But Lauren is losing it, completely losing it, and I'm afraid she's going to do something drastic." His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. "Please, Dad, just be careful. Just be..." "I know you think I haven't been paying attention, that I don't see what's happening. But I do. I see it all. And I'm asking you not for her, not even for me. Just be careful." The message ended. I sat in the darkness, the phone pressed against my ear even though there was nothing left to hear, and tried to understand what my son had just told me. I know what you're doing. Not an accusation, not a demand for explanation. A statement of fact delivered with something that sounded almost like respect. I understand. Not anger, not betrayal, acceptance. Be careful, not a threat, a warning, the kind of warning you give someone you're trying to protect. I played the message again, listening for nuances I might have missed, searching for the manipulation or the hidden agenda. But there was nothing except the tired voice of a man caught between loyalties, a man who had perhaps been waiting for exactly this moment without knowing how to bring it about himself. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in white. I thought about Daniel's expression over the years, the look I had never been able to decode. Anticipation, I thought, or guilt. Now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. Hope, perhaps. The desperate hope of a man trapped in a cage of his own making, watching his father from across an unbridgeable distance, waiting for someone to finally test the bars. Daniel said, "I know what you're doing." At first I thought he was angry. Now I wonder if he was trying to protect me. I spent 2 days thinking about Daniel's voicemail before he called again. This time I answered. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a diplomat negotiating between hostile nations, and I understood immediately that Lauren was somewhere nearby listening. "Dad, we need to have a family meeting," he said. "Clear the air. Lauren thinks there's been some miscommunication about finances, and she wants to make sure everyone's on the same page." I listened to the rehearsed quality of his words, the way each phrase sounded like it had been approved by committee. Lauren's committee. I imagined her standing behind him, arms crossed, nodding along as her husband delivered the script she had written. "No," I said. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. "No. There's nothing to discuss, Daniel. I've made decisions about my own finances, as is my right. I don't owe anyone an explanation, least of all someone who calls me a freeloader behind my back." I heard a sharp intake of breath that didn't come from Daniel. Lauren was definitely listening. "Dad, please, if we could just sit down together." My answer is no. I love you, son. But I won't sit at a table with people who've already decided who I am and argue for the right to be seen accurately. That's not a conversation. That's a trial where I've already been convicted. I ended the call before he could respond. My hand trembled slightly as I set down the phone, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar exertion of holding a boundary I had never before thought to establish. For 40 years I had been the peacemaker, the reconciler, the man who would drive any distance and endure any indignity to keep family bonds intact. That man had finally grown tired. What happened next I learned through the strange modern phenomenon of social media, where private grievances become public spectacles and family dirty laundry flutters in the digital wind for anyone to examine. Lauren, unable to control me through private manipulation, decided to wage her war in public. The post appeared on her Facebook page 2 days after my refusal. Margaret called to tell me about it, her voice tight with controlled anger as she read the words aloud. "Sad when elderly parents become manipulative and bitter," Lauren had written. "We've tried everything to help Dad Whitmore, but his mental decline has made him paranoid and hostile. If anyone knows good elder care resources, please share. We're at our wits' end trying to keep him safe from himself." I sat in silence as Margaret finished reading, feeling each word land like a small, precise wound. Mental decline, paranoid, hostile. Lauren had taken every quality that described her own behavior and projected it onto me with the confidence of someone who believed she controlled the narrative. She was betting that her version of events would become truth simply because she stated it loudly enough. "What do you want to do?" Margaret asked. "Nothing," I said. "Not yet." But the internet, I discovered, has a way of providing its own justice. Within hours, the comments beneath Lauren's post began to diverge from the sympathy she had clearly expected. Some people, mostly her friends from yoga class and the neighborhood book club, offered the support she was seeking. "So sorry you're dealing with this," they wrote. "Aging parents can be so difficult. Sending prayers for patience." But others remembered me differently. A woman named Patricia, whose children I had taught to fish at the community lake 20 years ago, commented with quiet precision. "Charles Whitmore built the playground equipment at Roosevelt Park with his own hands," she wrote. "He spent 3 weekends on that project and never asked for recognition. I have trouble reconciling that man with what you're describing." Robert, a former colleague from my engineering days, added his voice. "I worked with Charles for 15 years, sharp as a tack, honest as the day is long. If he's being difficult, I'd want to know why before I assumed the problem was his mind." A neighbor I barely knew wrote simply, "Charles brought flowers to my mother's funeral." He'd never even met her. He just knew I was grieving. The private messages began arriving that evening. People I hadn't spoken to in years reached out through the electronic ether to offer their support. I saw what Lauren wrote. One message read, "That's not the Charles Whitmore I know, not even close." Another said, "Something smells wrong about this. If you need anything, I'm here." A third, from a woman whose name I didn't recognize, explained that she had met me once at a charity event and had never forgotten my kindness to her elderly father. "You spent an hour talking to him about bridges," she wrote. "He talked about it for weeks afterward. You're a good man. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I read each message, slowly savoring the unexpected gift of being seen by people I had never tried to impress. Lauren had wagered that her public accusation would isolate me, would turn the community against a confused old man who had become a burden to his loving family. Instead, she had triggered an outpouring of testimony from witnesses she didn't know existed. Margaret called again that night, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "Lauren's post has over 100 comments now," she reported. "About half of them are questioning her version of events. Someone even asked why she's publicly shaming her father-in-law instead of handling family matters privately." What did she say to that? She deleted the comment, but not before several people took screenshots. I stood at my window watching the winter stars emerge one by one from the darkening sky. Lauren had tried to weaponize public opinion to transform sympathy into a cudgel she could use against me. But she had miscalculated. She had assumed that no one would remember the man I had been before she entered my life, that the only narrative that mattered was the one she chose to tell. She was wrong. Lauren wanted public opinion to be her judge. She didn't know that truth doesn't need a lawyer, it just needs witnesses. Margaret struck the next morning with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a woman who had spent 30 years in courtrooms, waiting for exactly the right moment to present her evidence. She didn't ask my permission. She didn't warn me what she was planning. She simply acted, and in doing so changed everything. Her comment appeared beneath Lauren's post at exactly 9 o'clock, when the maximum number of people would be checking their phones over morning coffee. I didn't see it until Margaret called to read it to me, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a chess player who has just declared checkmate. "For context," she had written, "over the past 15 years, Charles Whitmore financially supported his son's family with approximately $347,000. This includes mortgage assistance, debt payments, and monthly support. All given freely, never requested back. I have documentation available for anyone who wishes to verify these figures. I was Eleanor Whitmore's estate attorney and close friend for 40 years, and I will not stand by while a good man's reputation is destroyed by those who benefited most from his generosity." She attached nothing. She accused no one directly. She simply stated facts and let the mathematics speak for themselves. The internet, I learned, can turn on a person with breathtaking speed. Within hours, Lauren's post had transformed from a platform for sympathy into an arena of judgment. The comments multiplied exponentially, each one more pointed than the last. "Wait, he gave them how much money?" someone wrote, "and she's calling him a freeloader," another commenter. Someone I had never met did their own calculations. That's almost $2,000 a month for 15 years. Who exactly was supporting whom here? Lauren's supporters vanished like morning fog under harsh sunlight. The friends who had offered prayers and sympathy fell silent or deleted their comments entirely. A few brave souls attempted to defend her, suggesting that Margaret's numbers might be exaggerated, but they were quickly drowned out by the chorus of skepticism that had turned against Lauren with the ferocity of a crowd that felt it had been deceived. Lauren deleted the original post by noon, but the screenshots had already spread beyond her control. The narrative she had crafted so carefully, the story of a devoted daughter-in-law struggling to manage a declining elderly parent, lay in ruins. In its place stood a different picture entirely, a woman who had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from the man she mocked as a burden. I spent the afternoon in a strange state of suspended emotion, neither triumphant nor relieved. Margaret had done what needed to be done, but the exposure of family secrets on a public stage left me feeling hollow rather than vindicated. I made dinner without tasting it, watched the evening news without hearing it, and waited for whatever would come next. It came at 8 o'clock with a knock on my front door. I opened it to find Daniel standing on my porch, snow dusting his shoulders, and something I had never seen before burning in his eyes. He looked exhausted, older than his 41 years, but also somehow lighter, as if a weight he had been carrying for a long time had finally begun to lift. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside without a word. He walked past me into the living room, and I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it out to me with the gravity of a man presenting evidence in his own defense. It was a USB drive, ordinary, unremarkable, smaller than my thumb. "Dad," Daniel said, and his voice cracked on the word. "I've been recording Lauren for 18 months. Every conversation where she talked about you, every cruel thing she said, every plan she made." He swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm not the coward you think I am. I was building a case for divorce." The words hung in the air between us, reshaping everything I thought I knew about my son. "I wanted to tell you," he continued, the words coming faster now. "So many times I wanted to explain, but I couldn't risk Lauren finding out before I had enough evidence. Colorado is a one-party consent state for recordings. Everything on that drive is legal, admissible." He laughed bitterly. "Mom would have appreciated the irony. She always said I should have gone to law school." I looked at the USB drive in my hand, this tiny vessel containing truths I had thought were lost forever. 18 months of recordings, 18 months of my son quietly gathering evidence while I believed he had abandoned me. "Why now?" I managed to ask. Daniel's expression softened into something that looked almost like peace. "Because you finally fought back. Because you showed me it was possible to stand up to her and survive." He took a breath. "And because Mom left me a letter, Dad. Before she died, she told me everything, about the trust, about Margaret, about what she'd been planning. She said when you were ready to fight, I should be ready to fight beside you." Eleanor. Even from beyond the grave, she was orchestrating our salvation. The USB was smaller than my thumb, but inside it was 18 months of truth I thought I'd never hear. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor and I had shared 40 years of morning coffee and evening conversations, and Daniel told me everything. The USB drive lay between us like a bridge spanning the distance that had grown so wide I had believed it could never be crossed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the world in white silence, while my son finally spoke the words he had been holding back for years. "It started at Mom's funeral," he said, his voice low and steady. "After the service, when everyone was milling around at the reception, I went to find Lauren. She was in the hallway outside the bathroom talking to her mother on the phone. She didn't know I was there." He paused, and I saw his jaw tighten with the memory. She said, "At least now there's one less person between us and the money." Those exact words, Dad, standing in the church where we'd just buried my mother, and that's what she was thinking about. Not grief, not loss, just the inheritance she thought was coming her way. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I had known Lauren was calculating, had suspected her motives for years. But hearing this, knowing she had said those words while Eleanor's body was still warm, transformed suspicion into certainty, with a finality that left no room for doubt. "I wanted to confront her right then," Daniel continued, "to end it. But when I tried to bring up divorce a few weeks later, she changed. The woman I'd married disappeared and someone else took her place." His hands clenched on the table. "She told me that if I ever tried to leave, she'd take Tommy and make sure I never saw him again. She said she'd tell everyone I was unstable, that I'd been emotionally abusive, that she feared for her safety. She had it all planned out, Dad. Every move, every accusation. She'd been preparing her exit strategy for years just in case she ever needed it." "So you stayed?" I said. "I stayed, and I started recording." He looked at me with eyes that held no shame, only exhaustion. I knew that if I was going to get out, if I was going to protect Tommy, I needed evidence. Proof of who she really was. Colorado law allowed me to record conversations I was part of, so I started documenting everything. Every threat, every manipulation, every cruel thing she said about you when she thought no one was keeping track. The weight of what he had endured pressed against my heart. My son, whom I had judged as weak, had been fighting a silent war for 18 months. He had absorbed my disappointment, my cold silences, my unspoken accusations of cowardice, all while building the case that would eventually set us both free. "There's something else," Daniel said. He reached into his coat again and withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases from repeated handling. Mom left me a letter. She hid it in a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird on my bookshelf. She knew it was the only book Lauren would never touch. He unfolded the paper with the careful reverence of a man handling a sacred text and began to read aloud. Danny. Eleanor had written, I know about Lauren, I've always known. A mother sees things that a father's love sometimes blinds him to. I've watched her calculate every kindness measure, every gift against what she might gain. And I've watched you suffer in silence because you think there's no way out. Daniel's voice wavered but held steady. You're not trapped, my darling boy. You just can't see the door yet. When you're ready to fight, know that I've left tools for both you and your father. Find Margaret. She'll explain everything. And when the time comes, stand beside your father the way I know you want to. He'll need you, and you'll need him. I love you both more than words can hold. Be brave. Mom. The paper trembled in his hands as he finished reading. I stared at my son at the tears he was no longer trying to hide and felt the last walls between us crumble into dust. Eleanor had known. She had planned. She had written letters to both of us, planting seeds of resistance that would bloom only when we were ready to receive them. My wife, even in death, had been orchestrating our salvation with the patience and precision of a woman who understood that some battles require years to win. I rose from my chair. Daniel looked up at me, uncertain, vulnerable, in a way I hadn't seen since he was a small boy afraid of thunderstorms. I crossed the distance between us and did something I hadn't done since he was a child. I pulled my son into my arms and held him with all the strength I had left. You were never weak, I said, my voice rough with emotion. You were waiting, just like your mother taught you. Daniel's shoulders shook against me. We stood there in the kitchen, father and son reunited by the ghost of the woman who had loved us both enough to plan for the battles she would never live to see. Eleanor wrote letters to both of us. She'd been preparing for this war long before any of us knew it had started. Daniel stayed late into the night, and we talked until the words ran dry. When he finally left, promising to return the next day with Tommy, I stood at the window and watched his taillights disappear into the snow-covered darkness. For the first time in years, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed: hope. My son had come home to me. Whatever happened next, we would face it together. But Lauren, I knew, was not finished. Women like her don't surrender quietly. They escalate. The warning came 3 days later, delivered by Daniel in a voice tight with controlled fury. He had overheard Lauren on the phone with an attorney discussing something she clearly didn't want him to know about. The words he caught were enough to paint a clear picture: guardianship petition, mental incompetence, financial control. She's going to try to have you declared unfit, Daniel said. She thinks if she can get a court to say you can't manage your own affairs, she can take control of everything. She doesn't know about the trust, Dad. She still thinks your assets are accessible. I thanked him for the warning and immediately called Margaret. Within an hour, we had a plan. The following morning, I drove to Denver and submitted myself to a comprehensive cognitive evaluation administered by Dr. Richard Holloway, a neuropsychologist Margaret had worked with for decades. For 3 hours, I answered questions, solved puzzles, recalled lists of words, and demonstrated my ability to manage complex financial decisions. Dr. Holloway was thorough, professional, and utterly unsparing in his examination. When the results came back 2 days later, they were unambiguous. Mr. Whitmore demonstrates superior cognitive function for his age group, the report stated. Testing reveals no impairment in memory, executive function, reasoning, or judgment. The subject displays exceptional mathematical ability and maintains detailed, accurate records of his financial affairs. There is no clinical evidence to suggest diminished capacity of any kind. Margaret filed the evaluation with the county court that same afternoon, along with a preemptive statement from my personal physician confirming my excellent physical and mental health. We were building a fortress of documentation, and Lauren didn't even know she was about to charge headlong into walls she couldn't see. Her petition arrived a week later. I read it with a strange sense of detachment, as if observing someone else's life being dissected on paper. Lauren had crafted a portrait of me as a confused, paranoid old man who had become a danger to himself and others. She cited my erratic financial behavior and sudden hostility toward family members who only wanted to help. She requested emergency guardianship powers, claiming the situation was urgent and that delay could result in irreparable harm to the elderly individual in question. The court dismissed her petition within 72 hours. The judge, confronted with Dr. Holloway's comprehensive evaluation and my physician's testimony, found no grounds to proceed. Lauren's claims dissolved like sugar in water, leaving nothing behind but the bitter residue of her failed ambition. But the true devastation came from a source she never anticipated. I was sitting in Margaret's living room when her phone rang. She answered, listened for a moment, and then handed it to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "It's for you," she said. "Lauren's attorney." I took the phone, puzzled. "This is Charles Whitmore." The voice on the other end was male, professional, and audibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Whitmore, this is David Pearson. I've been representing your daughter-in-law in certain legal matters. I'm calling because I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about your financial situation." "Go on." He cleared his throat. "When Mrs. Whitmore retained my services, she represented that she had substantial knowledge of your assets and their accessibility. However, upon filing the guardianship petition, we received documentation from the court that revealed information she apparently did not possess." I waited, letting the silence stretch. "Mr. Whitmore, your primary assets are held in an irrevocable trust established 4 years ago. The grantor was your late wife, Eleanor Whitmore. The trustee is Margaret Hale." He paused, and I could hear papers shuffling. "There's a specific provision in the trust documents. If any party files what the trust defines as a bad faith guardianship claim against you, certain protective measures activate automatically. The assets become entirely inaccessible to any family member except through distributions approved solely by the trustee." The words washed over me like warm rain. Eleanor. My Eleanor. She had built this fortress brick by brick, provision by provision, while I remained oblivious to the war she knew was coming. "What does this mean for my daughter-in-law's claims?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It means she has no claim, Mr. Whitmore, none whatsoever. The trust was designed specifically to protect against exactly this kind of action. Your wife was—" He paused, searching for words. "Your wife was remarkably thorough." I thanked him and ended the call. Margaret was watching me with a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Eleanor made me promise," she said softly. "She said there would come a day when Lauren would overreach. She said all I had to do was wait and Lauren would walk into the trap herself." I thought of my wife dying of cancer, still finding the strength to plan for battles she would never see. She had known Lauren better than any of us, and she had loved me enough to build walls I would never need to defend, because the very act of attacking them would destroy the attacker. Lauren tried to steal everything. She didn't know Eleanor had locked the vault years before she even planned the robbery. Margaret called me the following afternoon and asked me to come to her house. Her voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before, a solemnity that told me we had arrived at a moment she had been anticipating for years. When I pulled into her driveway, she was waiting on the porch, despite the bitter cold, holding a cream-colored envelope pressed against her chest. "The conditions have been met," she said as I climbed the steps. "Eleanor's instructions were specific. The envelope was only to be opened if someone filed a guardianship petition against you in bad faith." She extended her hands, offering me the envelope like a priest presenting a sacrament. "It's time, Charles." We went inside and I sat at her kitchen table while she made tea. Neither of us would drink. The envelope felt heavier than paper, and ink should feel weighted with secrets and love and the ghost of a woman who had understood me better than I ever understood myself. My name was written across the front in Eleanor's elegant handwriting, the letters slightly shaky from the illness that was already claiming her when she wrote them. I opened the seal carefully, as if the envelope itself were precious, and withdrew 2 documents. The first was a thick sheaf of legal papers, the trust documents Margaret had referenced. I set them aside for later examination. The second was a letter, 3 pages of Eleanor's handwriting, and this I read immediately, hungrily desperate to hear her voice one more time. "My dearest Charles," she began, and I could hear her speaking the words, could see her sitting at her desk in the bedroom we shared for 4 decades. "If you're reading this, then I was right about them, and I'm sorrier than you know. Not sorry that I prepared, but sorry that preparation was necessary. Sorry that our son married a woman who saw you as an obstacle rather than a father. Sorry that I couldn't tell you while I was alive what I knew to be true." I paused, steadying myself against the tide of emotion rising in my chest. "You would have defended them," the letter continued. You would have made excuses seen good where there was none, found reasons to forgive what should never have been tolerated. That's who you are, Charles. That's why I fell in love with you 50 years ago and why I love you still. Your faith in people is the most beautiful and most dangerous thing about you. She was right. I would have fought her every step of the way, insisted that Lauren deserved another chance, that family loyalty demanded patience and grace. I would have been wrong, and Eleanor had known it. So I did what I had to do in secret. Margaret helped me establish the trust using the inheritance from my parents' money that was always solely mine. I named her as trustee because I knew you would never suspect your wife's best friend of conspiracy. I could almost see Eleanor smiling as she wrote those words. The provisions are simple but absolute. If anyone ever tried to have you declared incompetent out of greed rather than genuine concern, the trust would protect everything I've placed in its care. They cannot touch it. They cannot claim it. They cannot use the law to steal what you've earned. I turned to the second page, my vision blurring at the edges. I didn't want to control you, my love. I wanted to catch you if you fell. I wanted to build a net beneath the tightrope I knew you would walk someday when I was no longer there to hold your hand. You've always been too generous, too trusting, too willing to give until nothing remained. I couldn't change who you are. I could only make sure that your kindness wouldn't destroy you. The third page was shorter, the handwriting more uneven, as if she had written it on a day when the pain was particularly fierce. When you finish reading this, you're going to be angry with me. You're going to feel betrayed, manipulated, managed like a child who couldn't be trusted with the truth. And you'll be right to feel that way. I kept secrets from you, Charles, big secrets. I justified them with love, but they were secrets nonetheless. I wasn't angry. I couldn't find room for anger beneath the overwhelming weight of what she had done for me. But if I've done this right, if Margaret has followed my instructions, and Daniel has found his courage, and you have finally started to fight back, then maybe you'll understand. Maybe you'll forgive me. Maybe you'll look at our life together and see not the secrets I kept, but the love that made them necessary. She signed the letter with 3 words that broke something open in my chest. Forever yours, Eleanor. I sat alone in Margaret's kitchen as the winter sun faded and the shadows grew long across the floor. I read Eleanor's letter once, twice, 5 times until the words were etched into my memory like inscriptions on stone. She had known. She had prepared. She had built fortifications around my life while I remained oblivious to the siege that was coming, and she had done it all because she loved me too much to watch me be destroyed by my own goodness. The tears came then, the first I had shed since the morning I found her cold and still beside me. But these were not the tears of grief I had expected. They were tears of gratitude, of awe, of a love so profound it had reached beyond death to keep its promises. My wife loved me enough to prepare for the day I'd be betrayed. That's a kind of love most people never get to experience. The weeks that followed Eleanor's letter were filled with the machinery of justice grinding slowly but inexorably forward. Lauren withdrew her guardianship petition the day after her attorney explained the full scope of the trust's protections, but the withdrawal came too late to undo what she had set in motion. Some doors once opened cannot be closed again. Some consequences once triggered must be allowed to run their course. Daniel filed for divorce on a cold morning in January, walking into the courthouse with a folder of documents and the USB drive that contained 18 months of recorded truth. I offered to accompany him, but he shook his head. This is something I need to do alone, Dad, for Tommy, for myself. I watched him go, this son I had misjudged for so long, and felt a pride that brought tears to my eyes. The recordings proved devastating. Daniel's attorney played them for the judge during the preliminary custody hearing, and I was told later that the courtroom fell absolutely silent. Lauren's voice filled the space, sharp and calculating, discussing plans that stripped away any pretense of maternal concern. Tommy's college fund is just sitting there, she had said in one recording, unaware that her husband's phone was capturing every word. If things go south, I can cash it out and use it for a fresh start in California. He's young enough that he won't remember any of this by the time he's grown. In another recording, she was laughing with her mother about my health. The old man can't last forever, Lauren said. He's basically a dying ATM at this point. We just have to wait him out. A dying ATM. The word spread through the community like wildfire once the court documents became public record. People who had once accepted Lauren's charming facade now saw her clearly, perhaps for the first time. The sympathy she had cultivated so carefully evaporated, replaced by the particular disgust reserved for those who prey upon the elderly and vulnerable. The judge granted Daniel primary custody of Tommy, citing the recordings as evidence of Lauren's manipulative tendencies and financial irresponsibility. The ruling noted that a mother who would discuss raiding her child's college fund for personal benefit did not demonstrate the judgment necessary for primary caregiving. Lauren was granted supervised visitation every other weekend, a schedule that reflected the court's deep concern about her influence on an impressionable 8-year-old boy. Her parents reacted with the swiftness of people desperate to distance themselves from scandal. The same mother who had laughed about me being a dying ATM suddenly stopped returning Lauren's calls. The father who had raised his glass at the video that started everything quietly removed his daughter from the family business's board of directors. They didn't issue public statements or dramatic denunciations. They simply withdrew, contracting their circle of concern until Lauren found herself standing outside its boundaries. I watched her unraveling from a distance, taking no pleasure in her suffering, but feeling no obligation to prevent it either. She had constructed her own downfall brick by brick, lie by lie. I was merely a witness to the architecture of consequences she had designed without realizing what she was building. The phone call came on a February evening when the snow lay thick on the ground and the darkness fell early across the mountains. I was reading in Eleanor's chair, a cup of tea growing cold beside me, when Lauren's name appeared on my screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up perhaps a final curiosity about what she could possibly have left to say. "Dad?" Her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it, stripped of the confidence that had defined her for as long as I'd known her. "Please, Dad, can we talk?" I said nothing, waiting. "I know I made mistakes," she continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Big mistakes. I was wrong about so many things, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She was crying now, her sobs punctuating each sentence. "But everyone deserves a second chance. I'm Tommy's mother. I'm Daniel's wife. I'm part of this family. Please, Dad, help me fix this. Help me make it right." I listened to her tears, to the desperate pleading of a woman who had finally hit the bottom she never believed existed. Part of me, the part Eleanor had loved and worried about in equal measure, wanted to offer comfort, wanted to find the words that would ease her pain and restore some version of peace. But I thought about the video, about the Freeloader comment and the laughter that followed, about 15 years of condescension and control, about Tommy's college fund and dying ATMs, and every small cruelty she had inflicted while smiling that smile that never reached her eyes. "Lauren," I said quietly, "you had 15 years of chances, 15 years to treat me with basic human decency, 15 years to be the wife my son deserved and the mother Tommy needed." I paused, letting the words settle. "You spent every one of those chances teaching my son how to be ashamed of his father, teaching my grandson that I was too old and too slow to matter. You made your choices, Lauren, all of them, and now you'll have time to think about what those choices cost you." I ended the call before she could respond. The phone rang again immediately. I let it go to voicemail. It rang 3 more times that night, each call shorter than the last, until finally silence settled over the house like a blanket of fresh snow. Lauren's voice trembled, but not from anger anymore. For the first time, she understood exactly what she'd lost. Spring arrived slowly that year, melting the snow in patches and coaxing the first tentative shoots from Eleanor's garden. I watched the transformation from my kitchen window each morning, coffee in hand, and felt something inside me thawing as well. The winter had been long and brutal in ways that had nothing to do with temperature, but it was finally mercifully coming to an end. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in April. Daniel called me from the courthouse parking lot, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and relief that I recognized from my own journey through grief. "It's done, Dad," he said. "It's really done." I told him to come over for dinner, and he arrived that evening with Tommy in tow, both of them looking lighter than I had seen them in years. Daniel found an apartment 3 miles from my house, a modest 2-bedroom in a complex that catered to young professionals and people starting over. He joked that he fit both categories now. The shared custody arrangement gave him Tommy every other week, plus Wednesday evenings and alternating holidays. It wasn't the constant presence he wanted, but it was enough to rebuild upon. We established new rituals without ever formally discussing them. Every Sunday morning, Daniel and Tommy would appear at my door around 9 o'clock, and I would make pancakes the way Eleanor used to make them, with buttermilk and a touch of vanilla and blueberries folded into the batter. Tommy would set the table with the same dishes his grandmother had used for decades, handling each plate with a care that suggested he understood their significance, even if he couldn't articulate it. The conversations at those Sunday breakfasts were simple, unburdened by the weight of everything we had endured. We talked about Tommy's school projects and the friends he was making in his third-grade class. We discussed Daniel's new position at a marketing firm downtown, a job he had taken specifically because it offered stability and reasonable hours rather than the prestige Lauren had always pushed him to pursue. We planned weekend trips to the mountains and debated which vegetables to plant in the expanded garden plot I was preparing for spring. We didn't talk about Lauren. Her name became a silence we chose together, not out of avoidance but out of completion. There was nothing left to analyze, no wound that required further examination. She had become part of our past, a chapter we had closed and shelved with no intention of rereading. The silences between our words grew comfortable in a way they had never been before. Daniel would sit at the kitchen table watching Tommy devour pancakes with the bottomless appetite of childhood, and I would see him smiling for no reason at all. Sometimes he would catch me looking and nod slightly, an acknowledgement that needed no translation. We were father and son again. Finally, after years of distance, neither of us had known how to bridge. I found the letter on a Saturday afternoon in late May while cleaning out the last corners of Eleanor's study. The room had remained largely untouched since her death, a small museum of her presence that I had been reluctant to disturb. But the time had come to reclaim the space to honor her memory through use rather than preservation. The envelope was tucked inside a poetry anthology she had kept on her desk, the same book she had been reading during her final weeks. It was addressed to Daniel in her careful handwriting, but there was no stamp. No evidence it had ever been mailed. She must have written it just days before she died, when the cancer had stolen her strength, but not her clarity. I held the envelope for a long moment, feeling its weight, its promise. Then I set it aside and finished my cleaning, waiting for Sunday. Daniel arrived the next morning with Tommy as always, and we ate our pancakes and talked about nothing important. When Tommy went outside to play in the garden, I retrieved the envelope from where I had placed it on the mantel and handed it to my son without explanation. He looked at the handwriting and went very still. "I found it yesterday," I said. "She never mailed it. I think she meant for you to find it eventually, when the time was right." Daniel opened the envelope with trembling hands and withdrew a single sheet of paper. I watched his face as he read, watched the emotions move across his features like clouds across a summer sky. His jaw tightened. His eyes grew bright with tears he didn't try to hide. When he finished, he read it again silently, his lips moving slightly as if committing each word to memory. Then he looked up at me and the tears finally spilled down his cheeks. "What did she say?" I asked gently. He handed me the letter, unable to speak. I took it and read Eleanor's final words to our son. "My beautiful boy," she had written. "You were never weak. You were just waiting for permission to be strong. I give it to you now. Be the man your father raised you to be. I love you. I have always loved you, and I will be watching over you both until we meet again. Mom." I folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Daniel. He pressed it against his chest over his heart, and the tears continued to fall. "I miss her, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "So do I, son. Every single day." A year passes differently when you're no longer counting the days until something changes. The seasons turned without urgency, each one bringing its own quiet gifts. Summer blazed across the mountains and faded into autumn's gold. Winter returned with its familiar silence, then yielded once more to spring. I watched the cycle complete itself from Eleanor's garden, from my kitchen window, from the porch where I had learned to sit without restlessness, and I understood for the first time what contentment actually meant. I heard about Lauren occasionally through the peripheral channels that carry information in small communities, whether you seek it or not. She had moved into an apartment complex on the other side of town, a modest one-bedroom in a building filled with young professionals and people in transition. The house she and Daniel had shared, the one I had helped them buy 15 years ago, was sold in the divorce settlement. Her share of the proceeds after debts were settled barely covered 6 months of rent. She found work at an insurance company downtown, a mid-level administrative position that paid adequately but offered none of the status she had once considered her birthright. Her social media accounts, which had previously overflowed with curated images of success and sophistication, fell silent. The friends who had once gathered at her dinner parties and laughed at her jokes about the forgetful old father-in-law stopped calling. One by one, they drifted away, drawn to other orbits that promised more warmth and less complication. I didn't take pleasure in her diminishment. That surprised me at first, this absence of satisfaction at watching the woman who had called me a freeloader reduced to a life of quiet anonymity. But revenge, I was learning, had never really been what I wanted. I had wanted recognition. I had wanted respect. I had wanted to stop being invisible to the people who should have seen me most clearly. Lauren's fall gave me none of those things. Only time and truth, and the steady rebuilding of what had been broken could accomplish that. Daniel thrived in ways I hadn't dared to hope. His new job suited him, demanded enough to keep him engaged, but not so much that it consumed him. He had time now for the things that mattered. Time to coach Tommy's Little League team. Time to join me for fishing trips to the mountain lakes Eleanor and I had loved. Time to become the man he had always been capable of becoming once he was free from the weight of a marriage that had been suffocating him for years. He started dating in the fall, a woman named Sarah he'd met at work. She was kind in the uncomplicated way of people who have nothing to prove genuine in her interest and unguarded in her affection. The first time Daniel brought her to Sunday breakfast, I watched her interact with Tommy and saw immediately what my son had seen. She listened when the boy talked about his dinosaur collection. She laughed at his jokes without the performative quality that had always marked Lauren's engagement with her own child. She was in every way that mattered nothing like the woman who had preceded her. Tommy adapted to his new reality with the resilience children often display when adults expect them to struggle. He visited his mother on designated weekends, fulfilling the custody arrangement with dutiful acceptance. But increasingly he asked to spend his free time at Grandpa Charles's house, where there was always fresh pie cooling on the counter, and someone who had infinite patience for questions about why the sky was blue, or how bridges stayed up, or whether fish could feel sad. I became, in those months, the grandfather I'd always wanted to be. The grandfather Lauren had prevented me from being with her careful management of access and her subtle suggestions that I was too old, too slow, too irrelevant to matter. Tommy and I built model airplanes together. We planted vegetables in Eleanor's garden and celebrated when the first tomatoes ripened on the vine. We sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the stars emerge, and I told him stories about his grandmother that made her live again in the space between us. In the spring, on what would have been Eleanor's 64th birthday, I established the Eleanor Whitmore Scholarship Fund. Margaret helped me structure it properly, ensuring that the money I contributed would continue to grow and give for generations. The fund supported first-generation college students from our community, young people who had the talent and drive to succeed but lacked the financial resources to pursue their dreams. Eleanor had been a first-generation student herself, working 2 jobs to put herself through school, while her parents watched with pride they couldn't afford to express in dollars. She would have loved knowing that her name lived on in this way, opening doors for strangers who would never know the woman whose legacy made their futures possible. On the anniversary of her death, I drove to the cemetery where she rested beneath a simple granite stone. I brought white lilies, her favorite flowers, and placed them carefully against the marker. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of Colorado spring day that makes you believe the world is capable of infinite renewal. I knelt on the grass and traced the letters of her name with my fingertip. "You were right about everything," I whispered. "About Lauren, about Daniel, about what I needed to learn and when I would finally be ready to learn it." I paused, feeling the familiar ache of her absence, but also something new, something that felt almost like peace. "You saved us, Eleanor. Even from wherever you are now, you reached back through time and caught us before we fell. I don't know how to thank you for that. I don't know if there are words big enough." A breeze stirred the lilies, making them sway as if in response. I stayed for a long time talking to her about Tommy's latest accomplishments and Daniel's new relationship and the garden that was already producing more than I could eat alone. I told her about the scholarship fund and the first recipients, 2 young women who had written thank you letters so heartfelt they made me cry. I told her that I was happy, truly happy, for the first time since she left. When I finally stood to leave, the sun had climbed high overhead, warming the stone beneath my hand. "I love you," I said. "I will always love you, and I will spend whatever time I have left being worthy of what you gave me." I drove home slowly, taking the long way through the mountains, letting the beauty of the landscape fill the spaces that grief had hollowed out. Daniel and Tommy were waiting on my porch when I arrived, ready for our Sunday breakfast, even though it was only Saturday. Tommy ran to meet me, wrapping his arms around my waist, and over his head, I saw my son smiling with an ease that still surprised me after everything we'd endured. I used to think revenge meant destroying the people who hurt you. I was wrong. Real revenge is building a life so good, so full, that they spend every day knowing what they lost. Eleanor taught me that. Not through anger, but through love. And in the end, love won. And so ends the story of Charles Whitmore, a man who learned that the greatest strength isn't found in confrontation, but in quiet dignity. He didn't defeat Lauren through anger or revenge. He won by simply refusing to be diminished any longer, by standing firm in his own worth, and by trusting in the love his wife had left behind to guide him home. Eleanor saw the storm coming years before it arrived. She couldn't stop it, but she could build shelter. She couldn't change the people who would hurt her husband, but she could make sure they would never destroy him. That's the kind of love that transcends death itself, the kind that reaches across the void to catch the ones we leave behind. Every story we tell leaves a mark, and this one reminds us that real strength doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from knowing when to stand firm, when to walk away, and when to trust that truth will eventually find its voice. So I ask you now, what would you have done in Charles's place? Have you ever had to protect your peace from someone who mistook your kindness for weakness? Have you ever loved someone enough to prepare for battles you knew you wouldn't live to see? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the one that helps someone else find the courage to stand their ground. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of family betrayal, redemption, and the quiet power of love that refuses to surrender. And remember, sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply living well with your head high and your heart at peace.
Did you enjoy my story? What a journey it has been. I truly wonder, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have chosen silence to keep the peace, or would you have done what I did to reclaim your dignity? Let's meet in the comments below. I'm so curious to hear your thoughts. I'm reading every single one. Which city are you listening from tonight? If my story resonated with you, you can support me and help me bring more stories like this to the world by sending a super thanks. Your sweet support means the world to me and allows me to continue this journey with all of you. On the screen now, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend you watch next. There are so many more on my channel, each with its own lessons and triumphs. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter. Thank you for being here with me. Until the next story, with love and respect.